Bienvenidos al seminario institucional del Instituto de Ecología. Hoy tenemos el placer de tener a la doctora Anne-Claire Fabre, quien nos va a platicar del desarrollo como un driver, que sería un motor o un freno de la diversidad morfológica. Vamos a esperar un par de minutitos antes de hacer la presentación y iniciaremos con el seminario. Quiero nada más resaltar que esta invitación fue por parte de la oficina, bueno, de la coordinación del posgrado, pero no por parte de la coordinación como tal, sino de un estudiante quien propuso a la doctora Fabre como posible presentadora, y entonces invito a los estudiantes, si alguien está interesado, como seguiremos en esta modalidad virtual, que si quieren invitar a alguien que nos manden un correo y con gusto haremos los contactos para ver si se materializa. Entonces tenemos espacios para el semestre que viene, entonces les invitamos a proponer a investigadores, aprovechen ahora que estamos en esta modalidad virtual. También decirles que ya me escuchan, creo, ¿no? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I was not able to hear you for the last part. So should I start?
Yeah, no, sorry, I don't know, it just sort of disconnected me for a reason.
Okay.
Nada más también quería decirles que Anne-Claire tiene una conexión con México porque ya ha venido a visitar nuestro país haciendo trabajo de campo en los Tuxtlas, en Veracruz. Bueno, voy a presentar a la doctora Anne-Claire Fabre. Durante la mayor parte de su carrera académica ha trabajado en museos de historia natural, que muchos hablamos, son una fuente casi inmejorable de información súper valiosa, ¿no? Porque tienen cierta información hacia el pasado también que puede ser valiosísima, ¿no? Tiene una carrera muy internacional, pues ha trabajado en 7 distintos laboratorios en 5 distintos países. Realizó su doctorado en el Museo de Historia Natural en París, Francia, y el University College London en Londres, Inglaterra, donde estudió la evolución de la forma y la función en carnívoros. Luego ligó la variación en forma y función con datos de conducta y biomecánicos, estudiando primates en la Universidad de Duke en Estados Unidos. Expandió esta investigación de la relación entre la forma y la función, extendiéndola a lagartijas, ranas y aves, trabajando en el Museo de Historia Natural también de nuevo en París. Y finalmente ha estado interesado en la diversificación morfofuncional en distintos modelos vertebrados durante los últimos postdocs en el Museo de Historia Natural en Londres y el Museo de Paleontología y Zoología en la Universidad de Zúrich, en Suiza. Está a punto de iniciar un postdoc en el Museo de Historia Natural en Berlín, en Alemania, financiado por un prestigioso contrato de la Marie Curie de la Unión Europea. Y a pesar de ser muy joven, tiene ya más de 50 publicaciones en revistas cientificadas. Entonces, le damos las gracias a Anne-Claire por haber aceptado la invitación. So, thank you very much. And I leave the floor on to you. Thank you, Anne-Claire.
Thanks, and thanks for this invitation. Hi, everybody, and thank you again for inviting me to present my work today. And I will mainly talk about 2 studies that I recently published, and which are both of them about the impact of development on morphological diversification. So just right before to start, so as Alejandro just said, my research is mostly, I think, driven by research question more than by the taxon on which I'm working. And just to introduce myself, so basically I'm an evolutionary functional morphologist, and I have a deep interest in the factor impacting the evolution of diversity in form and function, mainly in vertebrates. So more precisely, I'm really interested in the links between morphological diversity and the way of life of species, so including the relationships between internal factors such as development, external factors such as environment, ecology, climate, and the evolutionary history of species. So let me just take another pointer. Right. So today we talk about one part of my research that I started to develop about 3 years ago, and which is about the impact of development on the evolution of organisms. So when you think about the evolution of organisms, I think that Wellington put it in a really nice way. The evolution of organisms must really be regarded as the evolution of developmental systems. And when you look at differences among different species, you really want to take into account as much as possible how developmental processes may shape the morphological differences or the differences in the evolutionary pattern that you may see across different groups. And this is something that you can do by looking, for example, at ontogenetic trajectories and plotting data through ontogeny. But this kind of data are unfortunately not available for all the species. So what you can try to get is through other kind of approach. And today, I will present a first example of my research. And this is a paper that I published nearly a year ago now, or over a year ago even, and which is about the impact of life cycle variation on morphological diversity in salamanders. So when you think about developmental processes, metamorphosis is kind of incredible, as it implies for the same individual different morphological stages, so from a larva to an adult, which are produced by the same genetic material. And in addition to that, what you can see here is that the majority of animals undergo metamorphosis, so which represents around 80% of insects and at least over the half of the vertebrates. So let's have a closer look at the phylogeny of vertebrates. And what you can see here, it's the phylogeny of the vertebrate at the genus level. So you really need to have a closer look at the number of species here. And what is highlighted in red are the species that are encountering a complex life cycle. So basically that are going from one environment to another by metamorphosis. And in yellow, it's a species with a single life cycle or a simple life cycle. And what you can see here is that complex life cycle is really widespread, and most of the species in vertebrates have this complex life cycle. So this may indicate that metamorphosis may be an important driver of biodiversity. So the benefits of metamorphosis are not really obvious. And several studies have tried to understand the advantages of such complex life cycle. So metamorphosis comes at a cost, as the animal is particularly vulnerable during its transformation, and there is a high risk of predation. And in addition to that, it's energetically costly, as the animal show an overall, or really often they show an overall morphological repatterning associated with drastic changes in the physiology of the animal, the diet, and the habitat use. But despite these costs, there are several benefits to be a metamorphic species. So one of the advantages is that the larval stage do not have to share the same resources as the adult. And this means that the intraspecific competition between the larval stage and the adult stage is decreased, and it may favor the population growth. So the thing is that we still do not really understand how different ontogenetic stages appeared, how they were maintained through time, and how they impacted species diversity. So it's totally in this context that we decided to realize this study. And in the paper that I will just present, we did a focus on salamander. But why salamanders? So salamanders have the advantage to display a tremendous diversity of life cycle. So some of them are biphasic, so meaning that from an egg they hatch to a larval stage, which is living and feeding in waters, and then they encounter a metamorphosis, and most of the time they end up as an adult stage, which is most of the time, but not all the time, in a terrestrial environment. So you can see that you've got an overall repatterning of the shape with different kind of diet and environment here. So, and this is what we call really a complete life cycle, because basically the animal from the larval stage to the adult one are living in different kind of environments. And they display really disparate stages. So other species are what we call direct developing species. And basically these species hatches directly as a terrestrial phenotype that is basically looking like the adult one, and they stay in the same environment during their life. One thing that you need to note here is that these species are still encountering a metamorphosis, but this is in the egg. So, but I will talk a little bit more about that later. Then other species are called are the so-called pedomorphic species, and it's kind of a weird mix of species that are encountering what we call a differential metamorphosis. And all of them represent completely aquatic species, and they retain aquatic larval traits, even if they are reproductively active. So they stay in water during the entire life, and they are still encountering a metamorphosis which is incomplete and with different kind of degrees. And at the end, they just basically are adults, but are looking like a larval stage. So as you can see on this phylogeny, so salamander include 10 families, and they display different developmental strategies that appear here, as you can see here, independently during the evolution. So you can see here with the color code, the biphasic species in red, the direct developing species in yellow, and the pedomorphic species in blue. So I will use the same color code during the entire presentation. And what you can see here on this phylogeny is that biphasic is the ancestral condition in salamander, and several independent evolution to pedomorphy are visible here. And you can see that direct development appeared in one big clade here, which are called the lungless salamander. So because basically they do not have lungs anymore, and they are also called the pleistodontids. So the goal of this study was really to test the impact of metamorphosis on cranial shape evolution. And what you can see here is just really quickly the diversity of head shape in salamander just by looking at the picture here. So some of them you may know them, such as the giant salamander, which is pretty famous. Here is a fire salamander, so it's one of the most common salamanders that you can find in Europe. Then you've got some weird pedomorphic species such as the Amphuma or the Pseudobranchus. And what is interesting is that even among the same genera, such as the Eurycea, you've got this tremendous diversity of morphology. So from a Eurycea that is pedomorphic here to one that is biphasic here. So this is just kind of incredible just from the external morphology of the head. But if you are looking inside, so here is for the same species, it's even more incredible. So I started to work on mammals, and I can tell you that they are really simple in comparison to this group. And here, I was dealing with the presence, absence of the bone, and these tremendous shape differences that you can see in the cranial system. So just to remember the goal, we wanted to test the impact of metamorphosis on cranial shape evolution, and for that we had some predictions. So the first prediction is following the literature, as Ronald Bonnet and Blair did a really excellent study on the same kind of topic, but looking at different kind of characteristics. So they were basically looking at the evolution of body mass and the vertebral column, and they did found that a simplification of life cycle tends to influence the rate, and the species that have a simple life cycle, so basically the direct developing species and the pedomorphic species, tend to have a higher rate of evolution. So we were expecting to find the same kind of results. Then for the second hypothesis, so we were predicting that species that have a complex life cycle, so basically the biphasic species, with a change in diet and environment, will tend to be more modular than the species that have a less complex life cycle. So I will come back on modularity and integration a little bit later for those that have no idea of what it is. And then the last prediction that we had is that the bones that are involved in food processing, or those that are remodeled during metamorphosis, will have an elevated morphological diversity and rate of evolution, and thus an increased ability to evolve. So here is our data set. So basically we were using nearly 150 species, and they are belonging to all the extant family, and they were representing the great diversity of morphology, life cycle, and habitat. So for that, we were mainly using, or we were only using CT scans that we did ourselves, or that some collaborator did and give us access on Morphosource and Digimorph. We were doing shape quantification using what we call geometric morphometrics. So we were quantifying the shape of 14 bones that you can see here with the different kind of color codes. So now I will move on to the result. And what you can see here is the result of what we call a phylogenetic principal component analysis. And you can see here the morphological space, or morphospace, that is representing the first two axes of the phylogenetic principal component analysis. Each point represents a species, and you can see that the phylogeny is mapped onto this morphospace. So it's a phylomorphospace. And you can see that species tend to cluster depending on life cycle. So you can see here in blue the pedomorphic species, in yellow the direct developing species, and in red the biphasic. So there is even more diversity. You've got some species that are viviparous and ovoviviparous in salamander, but I won't talk about it today because it's only few species in the dataset. So I was not able to include them in the analysis. And you can see here that the first principal component analysis tend to differentiate species with a fully aquatic life cycle, so the pedomorphic species, from the species that are either fully or largely terrestrial. It's also showing here a gradient of metamorphosis. So you've got the most pedomorphic species here and the less pedomorphic one here, and here you've got the biphasic one, basically. Then for the second PC axis, so the second principal component axis, you can see that this is describing or mostly differentiating the terrestrial direct developing species here, so the plesiodontid or the langless salamander, from the other one. And there's also some feeding modes that are different here, because basically this guy over there are using ballistic tongue, so such as chameleons, in comparison to the other ones that are using jaw prehension or ear suction feeding. So what is nice with this kind of analysis is that you can still come back to the shape. And here, basically, it's the shape change from the pedomorphic species to the biphasic one. And what you can see here is that in the pedomorphic species that are just there, they have a really streamlined cranium. So it's kind of perfect when you are aquatic to have a streamlined crania if you want to move and to feed underwater. And in comparison, you can see that the more terrestrial ones, such as that, have really a more robust skull. So then we were testing for differences in morphological diversity or disparity, depending on life cycle. And what we were able to show is that cranial diversity is influenced by life cycle. And the pedomorphic species that are still in blue show the highest disparity for all the bones, whereas the direct developing species in yellow show the lowest disparity. And the biphasic species tend to be intermediate between the direct developing species and the pedomorphic one. Then we were estimating the rate of morphological evolution of the cranium. And what you can see here is the rate of morphological evolution that is mapped onto the phylogeny with the color gradient on branches, which indicates the rate of shape evolution. So the warmer colors correspond to the higher rate of, or the faster rate of cranial evolution, and the cooler colors correspond to the lower rate of cranial evolution. The gray triangle indicates shift of rate of evolution. And what you can see here is that the pedomorphic and biphasic species have a fast rate of cranial evolution. So they are the ones that are with the most warmest color in comparison to the direct developing species. And every time that there is a transition in life cycle strategies along the phylogeny, you can see that there is one of these gray triangles, so you've got a shift in the rate of evolution. Then we were testing for the modularity and integration depending on life cycle in order to test if species that are biphasic, so with the change of diet and environment during their lifetime, tend to be more modular than species with a simple life cycle. So the concept of integration and modularity are really interesting, especially when you are studying evolution. And to test for that, you mainly look at the correlation between and among structures. So I really like to illustrate that with some stuff in design. And here you can see, for example, a chair that is fully integrated versus a modular one. And in the chair that is fully integrated, you can see that the legs and the body of the chair are highly correlated among and between each other. And it cannot move, basically. Whereas in the modular chair, you can see that each structure are more correlated among themselves than between themselves. So which allows the body and the legs of the chair to be quasi-autonomous between each other and then to generate novel forms. So modularity is also really often linked to evolvability and thus the ability of population to adapt quickly. But here, don't forget something. If you want to look at evolvability and adaptability, you need to be at the level of the population. And if you can see the same kind of pattern, then you can compare it in another level. So, for example, at the evolutionary level between species. So let's move back to my results. And here, what you can see are basically the result of modularity. And you can just have a look at the number. So we try to define the number of modules in here the cranium. And you can see this network that is basically trying to represent the cranial shape and auto-rate that. So if you are not used to this kind of network, so basically it's representing the correlation among the bone for the dots. So you look at the circle and you look at their size. So bigger the dots is, stronger the correlation with this bone is. And then you can look at the correlation between structures, and they are represented by the line. And thicker the line is, stronger the correlation between two structures are. And what you can notice here is that the species with complete metamorphosis, so the biphasic and the direct developing, are more modular than the pedomorphic one. So you remember here that I was telling you that these guys were still encountering a complete metamorphosis in the eggs. So it seems that here, species that are basically having this complete metamorphosis are more modular. So even if these guys are not changing of environment during their life, they're still as modular. Whereas for these guys that have this partial or incomplete metamorphosis, they are way more integrated. Then we were testing for the tendency to evolve disparate morphologies depending on life cycle. So for that, we were assessing the relationships between the rates of morphological evolution and the disparity for each module. And our results here show a correlation between the rates and the disparity in completely metamorphic species. So again, in biphasic species and in direct developing species. Whereas they are showing no correlation for the pedomorphic species. And what is interesting here is that we also show that different parts of the skulls don't always evolve in the same way. So for example, in species that undergo metamorphosis, so again, the biphasic and the direct developing species, you can see that some modules have a higher disparity and a faster rate of evolution, such as, for example, the suspensorium, which is composed of the squamosal, the quadrate, the jaw joint, which is part of the quadrate, and the pterygoid. It's the same case for the maxilla. And this module, it's interesting, are the ones that are implied with the change of feeding strategies through the life of the animal. So here, to summarize the result of this first study, we show that there is a cranial shape differences depending on life cycle, that there is an higher disparity and rate of evolution for pedomorphic species for each bone, that species with direct development have the lowest disparity and rate of evolution. We show also shift in cranial rate depending on change in developmental strategy. We also show that the direct developing species and the biphasic species are more modular than pedomorphic ones. And we show that structures that are implied in feeding have a higher rate and disparity in metamorphic species. And metamorphosis seems to really have driven cranial shape diversification in adult salamanders. So in the next step, and it's what I want to do in my next project now, is to add the larval stages to see if we can still see the same kind of thing. So now I will move on to mammals. And for this study, I was wondering how the differences in reproductive strategies have influenced the morphological evolution in species with simple life cycle, such as in mammals. And what is interesting here is that within mammals, we have quite a really broad spectrum of life history strategies within a group that is nearly entirely viviparous. And the majority of placental mammals are what we call precocial, meaning that they gave birth to relatively well-developed young, and in some cases, they can even be totally independent from birth, as you can see here, for example, in giraffe, in goat, or in guinea pig. Then you've got more altricial mammals, and this one should provide a lot of parental care after birth, as it's the case for us, for example, so most of the primates, many carnivorans also, and some rodents. And then at the end of the spectrum, so it's basically the extreme end of the spectrum, you've got highly altricial mammals, so such as in monotremes and marsupials, which are born highly underdeveloped, and most of their structure are developing after birth. So these differences are divided across the different clade of mammals. So most of the monotremes that are egg-laying mammals, and then marsupials that are viviparous, and they give birth to really altricial mammals, so both of them. And you can see, if you are looking at the number of species, that they also display a lower diversity in comparison to placentals that are giving birth to more altricial and precocial newborns, and they are displaying a greater diversity of species. And this really leads us to wonder all these differences in reproductive strategy have really driven these differences in diversity. So if you just focus on marsupials and placentals, you can see that marsupials have an extremely short period of gestation and a relatively long period of lactation. So in contrast, most placentals, mammals, have a really long period of gestation and a relatively short period of lactation. So now these differences in life history are reflected in the development of the newborn. And when the placenta is born, it's actually quite well fully formed. Its nervous and somatic system are largely formed, for example, whereas in marsupials, when they are born, they are actually quite underdeveloped in terms of somatic and nervous system. So you can see here in this Clarenstein newborn marsupials, here the red is showing the part of the body that are ossified, and you can see that their jaw are ossified, the forelimb are ossified, but actually part of the body such as the hind limb or the posterior part of the skull are not very well ossified or developed. So it was also shown that marsupials have a delayed brain development and an acceleration of the development of the oral skeleton. And these differences in the time of birth have been suggested to have affected the ability of marsupial to really evolve the diversity of forms that we can see in placentals. So for example, the early development of the forelimb means that they can't later repattern to that of flipper and wings, for example. And it has been hypothesized that this is because they have to be specialized early on to crawl out of the birth canal of the mother to go to suckle to the teats of the mother, basically. And some studies have looked at that in the forelimb, and they have shown that the forelimb of marsupials is more constrained than those of placentals in terms of morphological diversity. Then other studies have looked at it in the skulls, and they show that marsupials are less disparate or less morphologically, with less morphological variation than placentals. And in particular, they show that these differences are mainly concentrated in the bones that are implied in suckling. So basically the oral region. And in this study, we wanted to investigate this question. So is the marsupial jaw also constrained? So the jaw is a really interesting structure as it mainly have one primary purpose, which is feeding. And it's functional right after birth in all marsupials, as they have to suckle. So if functional constraints that are experienced during early development have limited the evolution of the jaw in marsupials, we predict that mandible disparity and rate of evolution should be lower and slower in marsupials than in placentals. So here we will test whether species with reproductive mode of marsupials have a lower disparity and a slower rate of morphological evolution than in placentals. Because you have several evolutionary theories that predict a positive association between phenotypic and species diversification, such as, for example, in the adaptive radiation theory or in the theory of the punctuated equilibrium. So this sample was chosen in order to represent a wide phylogenetic breadth, as you can see here, as well as much as possible of the diversity in ecology, morphology, and function among terrestrial, placentals, and marsupials. So here you can see a therian, so it's for placental plus their extinct relatives, so the fossils, that are represented in yellow, and then mesotherians that are for the marsupials, so the living one, and including the fossils too, that are represented in red. So again, I will follow the same color code for the rest of the presentation. And we were again using 3D geometric morphometrics. So here you can see the landmark protocol that we were taking for depicting as much as possible the mandibular shape. And I will directly move on to the results. And what you can see here are the results for the disparity. So it's what is called the Proclus test variance too, but it's the disparity of the morphological diversity again. And our results here are basically showing that marsupials, so mesotherians, mandible, have a lower disparity in comparison to eutherians. So basically, marsupials in red have a lower disparity than eutherians in yellow. And the difference here is that here I was doing it on the entire sample, so all the living species plus the extinct one. And here I was only doing it in the living species. And basically we've got the same result. So then we were looking at the rate of morphological evolution of the mandible. So here it's the interpretation can be done exactly the same than what I was showing you before for the salamanders. And here what we were able to demonstrate is that marsupials mandible have a slower rate of evolution in comparison to eutherians. So you can see that they tend to have really colder color. So it's more blue and green in comparison to the placentals one, where you can see a way more yellow and red. Then we were looking at the distribution of the species depending on mandibular shape variation. So again, we did a principal component analysis. You can again see here a phylomorphospace. And what you can see here is that the marsupial occupy the same part of the jaw morphospace as the placentals. So you can see that here they're sharing the same area of the morphospace. But you can also see that marsupials occupy a smaller area of the morphospace in comparison to the eutherians. And you can also notice that marsupials never invade some part of the placental morphospace, such as, for example, some part of the Artiodactyla morphospace or the primate or rodent morphospace. And even if both groups display the same range of terrestrial ecological diversity. Then we were running a phylogenetic maneuver in order to test if we can find mandibular shape differences depending on the infraclass, so depending if they belong to marsupials or placentals. And you can see that the result is not significant, so showing basically that there is no jaw shape differences between placental and marsupials. So it's not surprising, as you can see that marsupials occupy a small portion of the morphospace of the placentals. So this seems to indicate a certain level of convergences between both groups. So it's what we were testing afterward, and we were able to show shape differences depending on diet. And here what I will do then. So what we were doing is that we were testing for these convergences, and basically we were finding convergences for lingual feeders, so that are grouping species that are nectarivores, such as the honey possum, for example, that you can see here. It's this guy. And we were grouping that with the species that are mainly eating on social insects. So they are mainly eating ants and termites. So with, for example, the tamandua and the numbat. And we were also finding convergences between species that are from marsupials and placentals for the carnivorans, the brothers, the tuberivores, the grazers, the insectivores, and so on. But I will highlight that right after. And yeah, just to illustrate some of these convergences, you can see that there is several boxes, and I will highlight just some really cool examples. So you can see here that for some insectivore species, we've got convergences such as for the star-nosed mold, which is placentals, and the marsupial molds, which is a marsupial. Then for other insectivore species, we've got a really cool convergence here between the ai, which is this weird primate. It's the only primate with ever-growing teeth. And they've got this really weird way of foraging and feeding, in a way that they've got a really elongated third finger, and they are basically taping on the wood in order to locate grubs that are inside the wood. And then they are using their ever-growing teeth to just gnaw on the bark in order to access to the hole and to put the finger and then get the grubs in order to eat it. So this is a primate. And you've got a marsupial, which is a striped possum, and that is basically doing same kind of weird stuff. And you can see the convergences in the mandibular shape here. Then for other insectivore species, you've got the mountain shrew, which is a placental that tend to be convergent with the shrew opossum. Then for the lingual feeding species, so you've got, for example, the placental, the Sasan tamandua that is convergent with the honey possum. Then for carnivorous species, you've got the wolf and the thylacine. For other carnivorous species, you've got the giant otter shrew, which is convergent with the water opossum, so Chironectes, which is one of my favorite marsupials. Then another convergence for the brother species. This time you've got the black rhino that tend to have the same mandibular shape than the rhino-sized wombat, so diprotodont. Then another convergence for folivore species with a sloth for the placentals and a bear cuscus for the marsupials. And then now I'm done with the illustration of some example in this morphospace. And to conclude about this study and about this presentation, so we were able to show here that developmental timing and ontogenetic function have had a significant influence on jaw shape evolution in mammals. We were able to show that there is a lower disparity and a slower rate of evolution in marsupials compared to placentals. We also show that marsupials occupy a smaller area of the jaw morphospace than placentals do, despite similar ecological diversities. And we also show that jaw shape does not differ significantly between placentals and metatherian either. This is reflecting significant convergences driven by similar diets. So, and last but not least, I really want to thank all my collaborators, without whom it would not have been possible to do both of these studies. So you can all see them here. And I would also like to thank the collection that provided the specimens that I used for this study.